Morning, thank you for joining us today. It's beginner beekeeping Q&A. So we've got a great audience of people all around the world that tune in. Thank you very much. And what's really great to see is the way that people answer each other's questions. So I'm here to answer any questions you have, and the community is here as well, so don't be shy. Beginner beekeeping questions, now's the time to put them in. And the idea is we help just remove those barriers that might be stopping you jumping in and getting started in the amazing pursuit of beekeeping. So while you think of your questions, let's just have a look at this hive, and we might even harvest a bit of honey if we can see some in here. So first of all, this is our flow hive invention. Down the bottom we've got brood frames, just as the way they've always been, wood wax, the bees doing their thing, the queen laying her eggs. And then up the top here we've got the invention my father and I worked on for a decade, launched to the world in 2015, and now we've got more than 100,000 flow hives all around the world, and a community of beekeepers that really helps teach us a lot of things. So while you think of your questions, what we're going to do is just have a look in these side windows and just ascertain whether there is honey to harvest or not. And I'm looking at this rear window view, which kind of gives you a cross section of the frames. And I think we're just having a bit of technical problems, so we might just wait till we tune in and get the audio sorted before we get to answering your questions.
Looking like this Instagram's having a little issue at the moment, but we'll just reconnect.
Okay, we've just got an issue with the audio. If you're on Instagram, you could jump across to our Facebook page, or you could wait for us to get it sorted. We're just plugging in a new cable here, which is what you get with live streaming. It's hard to get it perfect all the time, so thanks for your patience. We've got a beautiful day here with lovely fluffy clouds, not much wind. It's actually the perfect kind of day you do for your brood inspections. And we're not doing a brood inspection today, but tune in next week and we'll be showing you right inside the hive to see what's going on down in the bottom here, where the queen is laying her eggs and the bees are doing their thing, making their bee bread, and really doing everything that bees do, which is an incredible feat when you think about the way you've got potentially 50,000 bees that work together as one organism, almost one kind of organism that can spread itself out over a 6 to 10 kilometre radius actually, and bring all of that nectar back into the hive, bring the pollen back, create the bee bread, and feed the bee bread to the young worker bee larvae. And if they feed royal jelly for the entire gestation of a bee, if it's a female, then it will turn into a queen. But as soon as they feed it plant proteins, which is the pollen turned into bee bread, through epigenetics, it turns into a worker bee. But if they keep feeding it royal jelly for its entire 11 days in its larvae stage, it'll turn into a queen and be supersized with long, bigger legs and a longer abdomen, and everything ready to lay up to a couple of thousand eggs a day, which is what you need to create the turnover of bees, because a worker bee might only last 4 to 6 weeks, and that means that the queen has to keep laying a lot of eggs to replenish those worker bees in order for there to be enough forager bees to fly out, collect that nectar and pollen and bring it back to the hive to maintain the size of the colony. And it's amazing what the queen can do, because she'll actually throttle the egg laying to the abundance of nectar and pollen. So you'll notice that when nectar is scarce, you'll get less and less bees in your hive as they go, uh-oh, too many hungry mouths to feed, let's just lay less eggs. And that way they can be more sustainable. We've got a few things to learn from bees, I think. And if you look in side windows, you'll see that the you get a good idea of the number of bees in a hive, where sometimes you look in, you can't even see the comb at all because the bees are so hard packed in there. And that's when it's a great time to take a split, take some of the frames out of the bottom and actually move it to another hive and start another hive. If you don't need another hive, then somebody else surely will, and you'll be helping somebody else get started in beekeeping. I'm looking in the side window. I can't see a whole lot of nectar in that side. And over in this side, I'm going to take the window off. It's actually a really nice feature, you know. When we first set out to do our flow hive, we automatically thought windows would be a great idea. When we spoke to commercial beekeepers about our flow hive invention, they're like, why do you want windows? You just lift the hive, you kind of just lift it up at the back, and when it's heavy, then it's ready to harvest. But now when we actually give them windows on the hive, they're like, oh, wow, that's really useful. So the windows have become a great feature as well, to be able to look in and see how many bees are in the hive, see whether the frames on the edge are full, and just helps create the picture of the health of the colony. Okay, we got Instagram live again, almost. Okay, thanks for your patience there. We're now live on our channels, including Instagram. Had a little issue there with the microphone. Today we're doing beginner beekeeping questions, so if you've got questions, tune in, put them in the comments below. Trace will read them out and I'll answer them. No such thing as a silly question. We've got a friendly audience here from all over the world, which is used to helping people get started in beekeeping. So no matter how ridiculous your question seems, just put it in the comments and we'll answer those as we go. And if you know the answer to somebody's question, then just get in there and help answer them as well. It's fantastic to see that happening, and we don't always know all the answers to the questions either, so especially things that are specific to regions. Perhaps you're in an area that's got deep snow, and we don't have deep snow here. We kind of don't have a winter as far as the Apis mellifera, European honeybee, sees it, because we get quite good honey all year round. Through the winter we get the paperbarks flowering, which have actually just kicked in, and they're bringing in a beautiful paperbark smell. So questions in the comments. Now let's get to it and harvest some honey while you're thinking of your questions. So the first thing I'm doing is looking in these windows and just getting a bit of a gauge of what's going on in the hive, and deciding whether there's a frame to harvest, deciding whether it's time to harvest at all. Now from this window, I'm looking across these frames and I can see this one's empty. There's no nectar or honey in there. This one's empty too. This one's got one little cell. This one's got more, and a few missing, showing that they're a bit low on honey. But if I was going to pick a frame, I'd pick this one because it's got full cells and it's still capped. And the reality of this hive is we've gone ahead and harvested all of these other frames over the last few weeks. If you have a look at this frame here, it is empty, but the bees have done their incredible work just ripping off the capping, reconfiguring the cells, and then the whole process starts again. And if you have a look at the other side, which is 2 weeks ago, you'll see that they've done the same thing, but they've put nectar right in the bottom of the cells. Give us a thumbs up if you can see the nectar down the cells there, glistening in the sunlight. It's a beautiful thing to watch that come in. So now that I know there is actually new nectar coming in, I feel okay about harvesting this last frame of honey here, because there's things flowering, the bees are going to find more nectar, they're not going to starve, because after all, this is their carbohydrate, this is their food, and at times when there's not much around, you need to leave that for the bees. And at times when there's lots, lucky for us, we can share some too and take some of those beautiful spoils of honey away to the kitchen. So what I'm going to do today is actually put the shelf on quite low. Now I'll grab these shelf brackets here, and while I could attach them up at this height for small jars, I'm actually going to attach them down here, right down here on this Flow Hive 2 Plus, and that will mean I can get a really tall jar, which is just something fun to do. And all I'm doing is using the cover that came off here to create the shelf with these brackets. And then with my big jar here, I'm just going to put it right under that frame, take this little cap out, this one goes in, a little tip there, there's a little tongue that unblocks an important point here, which is called the leak back point, where any remaining honey can go back for the bees to reuse. Taking out the key cap there, then all I need to do is insert this key in and turn it. And what that does is it's breaking these cell walls and turning them into channels. If you have a look here, what's going on is the honey is now dribbling down in this pattern here. You can see it, and that's what's happening in every cell line throughout the frame, and you can see the honey already starting to come down the tube here. Now I've opened about half of the frame. I'm going to go in and open the rest of it just by putting the key all the way to the back and giving it another turn. It can be hard to turn, do it in segments if it's a bit hard to turn. And I'm going to taste that because it looks delicious. Oh wow, it's fruity. I'm not even sure what that is. We get so many different flavours coming in, it's hard to pin them down sometimes, but the beautiful thing is you'll get different flavours per frame, and it was an unexpected thing with the Flow Hive to be able to isolate different honeys and bring those different honeys to the table, and I think that's a major benefit apart from easy honey harvesting. Now, Trace, are we getting any beginner beekeeping questions coming in?
We sure are, and lots of people tuning in from all around the world: Egypt, Russia, India, Australia, Melbourne, New York. No. Anyway, so one of the questions is, and there's a couple of people asking, what is the maintenance required for a flow hive?
So if we look at the flow frames themselves, when they're in the hive, they'll actually maintain, the bees will actually do the majority of the maintenance. Sometimes down here you'll get a bit of a honey build up in the bottom and you might need to clean that out, but rarely I do, and the bees will look after it. Now if you take the flow hive box off, and let's say you're in a cold climate and you want to reduce the size of your hive and take one or more honey supers off, this any honey collection box is called a honey super, and you'll be taking that off and storing it. Now at that point you could get things like vermin and mildew and stuff moving in. Best to keep it in the cold if you can, and away from the creepy crawlies, and that way you can put it back on in the springtime. When it comes to the hive itself, the hive body, if you oil it like we have on this hive, then you'll need to oil it every 3 or 6 months to keep it looking like good wood. Otherwise the mildew will set in. If you use a decking coat on the outside like this one, you'll get a year or two out of it before you need to reapply a coat. Decking products seem to last the longest. They're made to keep wood looking like wood outdoors for a long period of time. When it comes to the bees, how much you need to intervene with what the bees are doing depends on a few factors. One is whereabouts in the world you are, and the other is what happens with your colony. Sometimes you can lose the queen, perhaps they, for whatever reason, the queen perhaps got old. She can live for 6 years, but she stops laying so much in the last few years of her life, and the colony might dwindle. You might need to get in there and check that they do have a laying queen and replace the queen. There's varroa mite treatments which we're new to here in Australia, which are more demanding. In the springtime you might need to get in there and do your brood inspections more often and put in some kind of varroa mite treatment. And there's various different ways to do that, some more organic, some less organic, and a whole world of information about that particular pest. Down here in the bottom we've got a pest management tray to help you actually count mites or catch those pesky hive beetles. We've got these little black beetles called the small hive beetle in this area. And when your colony gets weak, it's time to put some cooking oil in the tray down the bottom here and catch some of those beetles. So that pest management tray is super handy for that. Now, there's been a long history in Australia of beekeepers going through their brood nests at least a couple of times a year to inspect for pests and disease. So that'd be the very minimum requirements. But here, now things are changing with the varroa mite, and once in every 16-week period we need to get in there and do a sugar shake or an alcohol wash to look for the presence of varroa. So that's a sort of a broad landscape of maintenance on a beehive. I think it's incredible how much produce you can get from a very small footprint. You can go away for months at a time. It's not like chickens where you need to be there to check they're okay and close the door each night. The bees will spend a lot of time just doing their thing and doing their amazing work, pollinating the surrounding area, and of course producing an incredible amount of gorgeous honey when the time's right.
Great. So there's a couple of questions come in, and actually I was speaking to a guy yesterday, John, in Alaska, and he sent through this incredible photo of his place in Alaska, which is of course the complete opposite of what it looks like for us here. And so one of the questions, and there's a couple, and another person from Alaska basically saying, do they work well in colder climates that can reach minus 35 degrees?
Wow, minus 35 degrees is very foreign to us here in subtropical Australia, but it's not foreign to the European honeybee, which is the species that humans have dragged all around the world with them wherever they go, because they're such incredible pollinators, and they also produce amazing amounts of honey. So originating from Europe, which does have long cold winters, we have the European honeybee that is really quite adaptable. It can be in desert conditions, it can be in deep snow conditions, and it can be in Alaskan conditions. Perhaps we'll put a link below for some of the stories we've personally gone and filmed in Alaska of people harvesting their flow hives there. So the answer is yes, the flow hive works well in cold climates as well as hot, as well as dry, as well as wet, and that's been proved well and truly all around the world.
Great. And maybe the flip side is that we've got someone who's tuning in saying where they are it's really hot and gets really hot in August, and do you have to do anything from keeping the bees from getting too hot?
So bees are amazing at their air conditioning. Now, in hot times, what they'll do, and it's one of the last jobs in the short life of a worker bee, is go and collect water, bring it back to the hive, and then they fan with their wings and do evaporative cooling. And that will actually cool down the hive, because they need to keep the brood nest, which is down the bottom here, at just a little bit below our body temperature at 35 degrees C. And that's important for the survival of the young larvae. Now, sometimes in extreme conditions, and I have got a friend who had two hives, they weren't flow hives, they were on a rooftop in Melbourne, and Melbourne can get incredibly hot days, like above 40 degrees C, and when you're on a rooftop it can be 10 degrees hotter, right, because you've got all the reflection off the roof. And they were sitting at their kitchen table, and they were like, what's that dripping from the light fitting? And onto the table they looked at this sticky stuff, and it was honey and wax, because their beehives had melted down on their roof, and the honey and wax had found its way down through the roofing, down through the light fitting, and onto the kitchen table. So that's a sad story about what we call a meltdown in a hive, where it does get too hot. Now, that's in an extreme scenario, and I've never seen it when you've got a hive out in a garden like this. And what we've done with the flow hive is built in a huge amount of ventilation. So if you're in areas that do have a heat wave, just you can put the vents at the top, which will allow air to go up through these holes, up into the screen bottom board, which is under here. And what you can also do is pull the tray out all together, which is in the bottom here. So if we open this, we have a tray, and we can slide that out, and we've been catching a few beetles here. You can see a few black beetles in the bottom. So, and it's probably time for a clean out. But under here, I don't know if you can see, but we have a screened bottom board. So if you take that out, you've got a huge amount of ventilation for your hive in those really hot times. And in cold, you can do the opposite, put this tray in and turn this up the other way to actually block the ventilation altogether up under that screen bottom board. So there's options here with your flow hive for hot and for cold. We're still hot here, so I'm going to put that in. Make sure you press it all the way up against the tray. Good tip there, because you don't want bees getting up into your pest management tray, especially if you've got oil in there that the bees could get trapped in. Look at this honey, it's gorgeous. It's really flowing nicely here.
Nice. Seeds, what happens if a queen lays 2 eggs in one cell?
Okay, if you see multiple eggs in a cell, there's 2 reasons for that. Sometimes a young queen can get a bit carried away as she's getting it together and lay multiple eggs in a cell. Now the hive will work that out, and it's not too much of a problem, but the more common reason why you see multiple eggs in a cell is you've got laying workers. So if you see multiple eggs in a cell, especially if they're really poorly laid, the queen, when she's in her prime state, will put an egg perfectly in the center at the bottom, all looking good and more organized. The worker bees, when they lay, will go crazy, laying clumps of eggs, sometimes on the sidewall, sometimes in the bottom, and that's a sign that you don't have a queen. And some species of insects, including bees, can actually the non-normal egg laying members of the colony will start laying, and what you have is laying workers. So to rectify that situation, because they can't fertilize those eggs because they haven't mated with drones, then they can only be male bees. So what will happen is your hive will turn into a whole bunch of drones, and they don't collect pollen or nectar, so the hive will slowly dwindle out. So what you'll need to do, if you see laying workers, is really have a look around and make sure you do have worker brood and a laying queen. If you don't, you'll need to rectify that situation by buying in a queen from a queen breeder, most preferably, or moving a frame from another hive to your hive without the queen, and make sure there's eggs in the bottom of the cells, just 1 egg in each, and they will raise a queen from those fertilized eggs, and that's how you can fix it up.
Great. Pablo's tuning in from Belgium, and the question is, how do you get bees? Where do you get them from? Or do they just go into the hives by themselves?
So rarely bees will just move into your hive. Let's say you put the hive out in the garden and hope for bees to come. You might be waiting years before they do. You will increase the chances if you're in an area like this where you've got a lot of beehives around and it's springtime. Then there's a reasonable chance that bees might just move into your hive. And that technique is called a bait hive, where you strategically put just the brood box out, and you might even put some lemongrass oil in a Ziploc bag and put a couple of pinholes in it to try and mimic some of the queen pheromones to attract a swarm. And you'll be putting that hive, say 6 to 12 feet off the ground, out the front of an existing apiary, and that will really increase the chances of getting bees to move right into your box by themselves. But in reality, what we do to get started in beekeeping is we get bees off somebody else, or we catch a swarm. Catching a swarm is something you can do in springtime, very adventurous if you want to start that way, quite fun. Sophie here we've got a video of her catching a swarm on the mango tree over here, and that was her introductory to beekeeping. So it's a fun way to start, but you've got to find a swarm to begin with. So more reliable is to order what's called a nucleus hive off a bee breeder, where you've got a going little hive with about half as many frames that fit in this bottom box, and you'll get that going little hive, which is usually about this big. You'll put it in the back of your car and transport it to your location, and you'll set it up. If you wanted the hive to be here, you'd set the little nucleus hive up here, and on the next warm sunny day when you've got time, you can then transfer your bees to your bottom box. You're in your bee suit, you've got out your smoker, you're wearing your gloves, and you transfer those frames to the bottom box, look after them, and they'll grow. And when they're ready and they've filled out the rest of the frames in the bottom box here, you can go ahead and add the honey super, which in this case is our flow hive invention for easy, gentle honey harvesting.
Nice. Saddlebrat wants to know, how do the bees get in and out of the hive?
Well, we'll make Callum jump up and have a look at the entrance of the hive, and let's just see what's going on here this morning. And let's see if we have much bee activity. Oh yeah, look at that. The bees have woken up and gotten started. There's forager bees coming back with pollen on their legs. There's lots of bees returning home heavy with honey. I'm seeing white pollen, orange pollen. It's a good thing. And watching your bee entrance, if you're new to beekeeping, make sure you protect yourself, wear your veil or your bee suit when you're around the entrance side of the hive. Some bees can be quite territorial, especially on the entrance side of their hive. But watching them is a great way to learn and see whether you've got nice pollen stores coming in, whether the bees are finding that forage and doing their amazing pollination.
So do you need to put wax on the flow frames?
You don't need to, but you can if you want to. I almost never do, apart from a show and tell. And if you look up 2 weeks ago, Facebook Live, maybe a little bit longer, 3 weeks ago or so, on our balcony hive, we added some wax to the flow frame. We showed you how to do that, and they will actually recycle that wax in that area and use it to put the flow frame parts together and form cells ready for the bees to store their nectar. So that can be done just by scraping some wax off the top of the brood frames. If they are ready for the super, they would have started to build wax on top of the frames. You scrape it off with your hive tool, just mash it into the flow frame surface. It won't actually damage the comb at all. Just mash it in, put that on the window side, and enjoy watching them recycle that wax and join all the flow frame parts together.
Nice. Adrian's tuned in from California and wondering, would you recommend removing the super over winter in California? No snow and very mild winters.
So in California, you've got a similar climate to us here, and you can keep it in this configuration all year round. So you've got your excluder in place, you've got your super on top, you've got your brood box down below, and you'll find the bees will be fine in that state, and they will often find a little bit of forage through the winter time too, and in the spring they'll really get going and store an amazing amount of honey in your flow hive.
Nice. Now Michelle's got a couple of questions. Can the flow frames be stored in the fridge rather than in the freezer?
Absolutely. So if you do have a really cold climate, and it's typical in cold climate to reduce the size of your hive. Let's say cold climate beekeeping, you often make a bigger hive so that they've got more stores for a long winter, but perhaps you want to take one of those boxes off and store it over that winter time. Then keeping them in a fridge would be a great way to keep them away from vermin and stop any fermentation occurring if there's any nectar left in those frames. And then you can get it out again in the springtime and put it back on your hive. If you don't have a deep freeze or a fridge to keep it, you might have a cold enough region that putting it in a tub out in the garage where it's getting some nice cold temperatures will do. Or what you can do is just make sure they're free from any honey or nectar and then just store them in a tub, and they'll stay good as well. What you want to avoid is having nectar and honey left in warmer climates and fermentation occurring and vermin getting to them, etc. You want them to stay nice and tidy for when they go back on. If they haven't, and let's say your flow frames are a bit of a mess come springtime to put them back on, don't worry too much. Just get a brush and brush all the debris of wax moth and whatever might have gotten into them away. If there's fermentation and mildew on them, then you might want to give them a good pressure wash with a pressure washer. Then let them dry and then put them back on the hive. The bees will actually do a great job of the final cleanup of your frames.
Great. And then the other part to Marcello's question, who's actually in Melbourne, was should I even think of removing the flow frames for winter or just leave them where they are in the super box on the hive?
In Melbourne?
In Melbourne, yep.
So my sister keeps bees in Melbourne, and it's a great spot to keep bees. You could go either way here. Some people pack their bees right down, depends a bit on the colony. If you had a weak colony, you might like to pack it down just to a single box, so that there's less area for the bees to look after during that cold winter. Now, if your bees are a thriving colony, you're sort of in between a really cold climate and a warm climate. They're in Melbourne, and you could just remove the excluder, and that will allow the bees to move up and consume honey in the flow hive super, and the queen can then travel with those bees, stay warm and kept fed over winter, and that way you'll start the spring with your queen. You do risk, if you leave the excluder in a colder climate, that the queen gets orphaned behind and perishes, and you start the spring without a queen, which will mean you'll need to purchase a queen in to get them going again. So a little tip there, in colder climates, if you decide to leave your flow hive super on, removing the queen excluder is a good idea, so that your queen can travel with the bees and survive that winter.
Great. Now Marcus is at the other end of Australia, up in Townsville in northern Queensland. Started about a month or so ago. The brood box filled really quickly, the super, it's all happening, they're going up into the super. But just wondering, tips on when you take the super off, how do you basically stand your super, or what do you do with the super when you take it off to inspect your brood box?
Okay, good question. So what I like to do, and if you dial back to some brood inspection videos, you can see us do that live, where we get the chisel tool here, and you're in your bee suit, you've got your smoker, you've got your gloves on, and you're cracking that top box just by going around to each corner like this and loosening it up. And then I find the best way to carry it is you take this window off, so you've got a really good handle, you've got another good handle on the other side, you take the roof off and you lean it back against your body that way, so it's a lot stronger than trying to do it in the other direction where the weight's further out. So you're leaning it back, and once you've got it, you can then squat down and tip it onto the front face. So in this case, I'm keeping the frames in this orientation so the nectar doesn't fall out. If you put it on the side, what's going to happen is you'll get a bunch of nectar falling out of the cells. Not the end of the world, but if you can avoid it by putting it on its end, it's better. And the reason why I say end rather than keeping it this way up is we don't want to squash bees, and there'll be a lot of bees when you take this box off on the underside here. So you're just upending it like that, keeping it in this orientation and putting it on the ground or on top of something if you don't want to bend all the way to the ground.
Nice. Tasmart's asking, what is the season we're in Australia now, and whereabouts are we?
So we're on the east coast of Australia near a place called Byron Bay, and it is just the very start of autumn. So we look forward to it being a bit cooler. We've had a very warm, sticky, sweaty summer here, and the autumn is a welcome time here where things just chill down. You get the cooler nights and often really quite nice weather.
Yeah, now Kerry's in Perth, which is on the other side of where we are here in Australia, and she's wondering, is it common or okay for bees to drink or eat from grapes? I have a grapevine and have noticed my bees all over the very ripe grapes.
Cheeky, they're going, bypassing the flower stage and going straight for the sugar that's been produced by the grapes. I haven't seen that, so that's cool to hear. But bees will actually be quite opportunistic, and they will forage on tree sap if it's sweet, and that's called honeydew. And they will forage on the frangipani rust on the other side of frangipani leaves, which is actually more like a pollen. And they'll also forage on the sticky goop behind an M&M factory, which has surprised beekeepers in one area in the world, where they started to get purple honey in one hive and red in another, and they were scratching their head on what was going on, and then they found that they had sweet stuff behind an M&M factory that the bees were going for. So I'm not surprised they're going for grapes, but I haven't seen that, so great to hear.
Yeah, I wonder what the honey will taste like. Maybe it's like wine honey.
Oh,
Wine.
yes. Yeah, what type of, is it a Chardonnay
I
honey?
know, what is it? Oh, Shiraz honey. Oh, look, we've got Nicole's tuning in from Alaska as well, and just wondering how much honey is produced from one flow hive.
This is a nice example here of a single frame, and what you've got here is an enormous amount of honey, with about 3 kilograms. So if you harvested every single frame, which we actually have done in this hive over the last month for various different show and tells, you would have 3 times 7 or 21 kilograms of honey, or 7 of these big jars full, which is amazing, I think, to get a real amount of produce from a very small footprint in your yard. And that can only happen because the bees are spreading out over a 6 to 10 kilometre radius and bringing that nectar back to the hive and going through that amazing process of dewatering it and creating honey.
Nice. Now,
In
heaven.
the springtime,
sorry.
you can actually get harvest this hive multiple times. So it's a lot of honey from one hive.
Amazing. Cedar, is it all right to use a varnish or a yacht varnish on the outside of the hives?
By all means, experiment. You are fighting nature when you're trying to keep wood looking like this freshly cut wood outdoors. So eventually it'll be trying to turn back into what wood naturally does outdoors and turning grey. So the varnish will last a long time, perhaps a year or two, and it depends. If you're in a really wet climate, you may get water seeping underneath that varnish, and once that happens, you will need to then sand away that varnish and reapply. And for that reason, we tend to steer away from varnishes, because that's a hard job to sand back the varnish and reapply, compared to other coats where you can just reapply straight over the top.
How do you choose queens who will thrive in cold climates? Do they wear little puffer jackets or something?
That's right, you look for the ones with the little puffer jackets. And so getting bees from your local area is a good idea. They will be somewhat acclimatised to your area, and you'll find that they should do well, provided the queen breeder's been doing a great job of breeding for nice productive traits and hopefully hygienic traits as well, where they can look after pests and diseases in the hive better than others. So a bee breeder will be breeding for honey production, breeding for nice gentle temperament, and for hygienic behaviour, so they are good at looking after themselves down here in the brood box. If you are going to buy a queen off a queen breeder, then ask for those traits. And if you're new to beekeeping, probably a nice gentle colony is the preferred thing to start with, because like we are here, you can sit around and enjoy the process of honey harvesting without them stinging you, which an aggressive colony, when they're really aggressive, they tend to defend their hive as you get close to it.
Right, now there's a few questions coming in, Cedar. How much yard or garden space do you need to have a flow hive, and how far away from your house do you have to have it?
One of the amazing things about bees is you can keep them just about anywhere in the world, and in amazing places like balconies in the city, or rooftops in the city, or in urban backyards, or out on farms. So they're quite versatile like that because they have a very small footprint. My sister kept bees in Berlin. She had a number of hives on her little Berlin balcony in the middle of the city, and that can be a wonderful thing to do. And I think humans really yearn to be able to do farming and create produce, and bees are one of these extraordinary things that enable people, even if they don't have land, to be able to do some farming and create some real produce.
Great. Ashley's noticed most people paint their hives. They may have the hoop pine hives. What colour are bees most attracted to?
So the bees actually won't care what colour your hive is. That's more of a human aesthetic. So you can go ahead, go wild with your paint job if you want, and the bees won't mind. Now, in terms of bees in your garden, we find the purple flowers are great for attracting specific native species here in Australia. If we look right now, I can actually hear some blue-banded bees buzzing away on these purple flowers. So if you do want to attract native bees to your garden in Australia, then get some purple flowers going and you'll see some of those iconic species coming. And that's why we plant this forage. It's not so much for the European honeybee, because they need a big area of perhaps 3 kilometre radius to forage on, whereas the native bee species will only move a few hundred metres often, so they need these little stepping stones and gardens like this. Getting back to the hive, here's a beautiful paint job here done by Isabella, and that's great inspiration to get out the paints and have fun with your family painting up your hive. And here's the blue-banded bee. It's very hard to photograph because they move very quick, but you'll see these amazing blue stripes on it, which is very unusual. And I wish I had my macro lens out about now.
And Cedar, maybe it's a good time to ask, Eugene's asking, these are European honeybees, and does this in any way negatively affect the biodiversity of the bumblebee population?
Okay, we don't have bumblebees here in Australia mainland. They are in Tasmania. They are an introduced species there in Tasmania. But in countries where the bumblebees are native, then there is those questions that come up around whether European honeybees are competing with the native bees and whether that's a good thing or not. So I'll tune in with my perspective on that, and often you'll get these kind of sort of fights online about whether or not it's a good idea to keep European honeybees in countries other than Europe, because they are an introduced species, if you like. And what I think is humans have taken honeybees around the world wherever they go because they're such extraordinary pollinators, and now they are intertwined with our food system, and we really need European honeybees to be kept in all areas where we're doing our agriculture, and therefore we need enough beekeepers to look after them. So keeping this species is really important for human survival, actually. As to whether they should be here or not, well, you could argue that they shouldn't, along with our agriculture, along with the way we do our housing, and it should all be back to natural bushland. And I like that picture. But here we are, as we are, and we need the European honeybee. So I think we shouldn't really argue about whether they should be here or should not be here. What we actually need is habitat for both native bee species and the European honeybee. because that's what creates the biodiversity that makes pollinators thrive, and in turn makes the whole system thrive. So that's why we have put a lot of effort into creating habitat. And if you have a look at the beekeeper.org, it's an online platform we've created, and also an amazing fundraiser. It's educational content for beekeepers with amazing video content to take you from square one right through to deep scientific knowledge in beekeeping. And from funds raised from that, we have now planted 1 million trees last year, 500,000 trees this year, with the idea of creating high quality ecosystems to support not only our native bee species, but our European honeybees and everything that really needs more habitat. We are in what's called the 6th mass extinction here, and we are losing species of pollinators each year, and let's see if we can save some of them from the brink of extinction. So I say, let's not argue about this bee or that bee, but let's all work together to create habitat for all bees, all pollinators, and everything we need to keep the natural system alive.
Great, thanks Cedar. Look, a few people can look at the flow hive and think, oh, how can this be real? How can you get honey out of it like this? I guess, how do you prove that what you're doing is for real, Seeds, that this is actually coming from honeys and bees?
Well, I guess we could be really clever and be CGIing it every week on the live stream. It'd be an incredible feat. But it kind of tickles me that we've invented something that we still get disbelief about. Because when we started, we had a lot of disbelief that what we were putting on crowdfunding was true. And it came from such incredible exposure when our invention kicked off with 1 million views on the first little video we put out, and then what is now probably billions of views on our content of the Flow Hive. And from that we get everything from people wildly excited about it to people in disbelief that it's actually possible. But how do we prove it to you? Let's have a look here. We've got honey coming out of the hive and into the jar, and if you dial back in this video you'll watch that it's been filling while we've been rabbiting on answering questions. You've got bees in the side window doing their thing, they've hardly noticed. That frame we harvested recently, they've ripped all the capping off and they've rebuilt the cells ready to go again. And on the other side, well, there's the entrance, you can see the bees flying in and out, so I'm pretty sure it's real. But chime in and let us know what you think. Around this side you've got nectar in the cells, so that's a frame we harvested a couple of weeks ago. They've ripped off most of the capping, there's still a little bit to go, and they've already started depositing nectar in those cells, and the whole process starts again. So you've got a little cross section of what's going on in the hive and the beautiful honey pouring straight out.
What does it taste like today, Seeds?
It's got this beautiful fruity flavour that I can't pin down actually, and I really enjoy that because sometimes you get that's paper bark, or that's the wild quince, or that's the palm, and you know that you've got these different flavours coming in. But a lot of the time, because there's as many different flavours as there are different types of nectar producing flowers in the world, you find it hard to pin down what the actual flower source is that's creating that honey. But to me, it's one of the beautiful things about beekeeping, and one of the unexpected, amazing things about the Flow Hive is being able to isolate those flavours and bring those stories to the table and help inspire different dishes in the kitchen and so on.
Nice. Now Vanessa's having a bit of an issue with ants coming into the hive. Just wondering, what do you suggest is the best way to get rid of them?
So ants are a cosmetic annoyance really. They don't harm the hive, the bees will keep them out of the hive. But if you want to get them out from behind the windows, which is typically where they're taking up residence in those wet times, they'll move up out of the ground and take up residence behind these covers. Now, to get rid of them, there's a few things you can do. One, if you've got our Flow Hive 2 Plus, you've got these ant guards, or you can fit them to the Flow Hive 2. And what you'll be doing is just lifting this up and putting some oil or white grease in that, so some Vaseline could be a good choice. And if you've got large ants, you'll be keeping the lid up a bit higher so they can't walk across that gap. If they're smaller, then you can wind it right down, which will help keep the rain out of that lower cup there. Now, of course, it won't work if you've got foliage touching the hive like this. The ants will just walk across it. So you'll need to clear away the foliage. Then what you'll need to do is get behind the covers, brush the ants away, take the roof off here, brush them out of underneath there, take this cover off, brush them out of there, and do that a couple of times in order to get rid of the ants, as you say, and the problem will go away till next time. Another tip, if you don't have these ant guards here, is you can throw some cinnamon powder behind the covers, and that'll work as a bit of a deterrent. And you'll need to do that a couple of times as well in order to annoy the ants sufficiently to move homes to somewhere else.
Sita, do you recommend taking out some of the honeycomb in the brood box if the brood box is getting full?
Sometimes, especially in the springtime, you can get what's called honeybound, where you've got so much honey downstairs the queen has nowhere to lay, and that is the primary trigger of swarming. So in the springtime, great idea to take some honeycomb out of the bottom box. As you say, you might like to just take the frame out. If you're using naturally drawn combs like we like to promote, then you can take those frames out and just cut the comb right out there in the field, take that comb away and put that wooden frame back in the centre. They'll draw the comb out quite quickly, more real estate for the queen to lay, and away they go with some more space, and you get to enjoy that honeycomb from the edge of the hive.
Nice. Now Adrian's asking, once your colony has grown, say year 2, do you recommend getting a second hive or just building the one flow hive setup upwards and by adding another brood box?
Well, you can do either, and I really recommend you experiment and see what works for you. Now, some people like to make the hives a bit higher, add another brood box or add another super so there's more room in the hive. They are less likely to swarm in the springtime if you do that. You may not need to take a split in springtime. What I prefer to do is keep them this size, take a split in the springtime and create another colony. There's a few reasons for that. One is it's a bit easier to manage your hive and find the queen when you've only got a single brood box like this. And we live in a temperate area where we don't really need any bigger hives. We're in the colder regions, you might be having a bigger hive so there's more honey stores for the long winter, and also a bigger hive for the compressed honey season, where a whole lot of bees are building up in an extreme way as everything starts to flower at once, because it kind of has to. Let's say everything in Canada might flower in 3 or 4 months. The hives go absolutely ballistic, building up with such an abundance of nectar and pollen that you'll need more boxes on your hive. So there's a few options there. There's always complicated answers to beekeeping, but you can experiment whether you take your splits, which is what I like to do, or adding more boxes to your existing hive.
Right. So it's beekeeper from South Australia here. Just wondering, what is the recommended time to stop harvesting in preparation for our winter here in Australia?
Okay, great question for your local beekeepers. I haven't kept bees in South Australia, but if you're from that area, chime in and help answer the question. I would say as a guess, you'll get a nice autumn flow and then it'll all shut down for the winter ahead. So you could probably expect a bit of a flow of nectar as some tree species start flowering in that autumn time, and as it draws closer to winter, that'll wind up and it'll be time for your bees to hibernate during the winter months. But as said, ask your local beekeepers, especially very local to your area, because it can be so different even half an hour's drive away from where you are.
Nice. Now, a couple of people asking about purchasing flow hives and maybe us not shipping to those countries. Look, just please contact customer support, and we've got a great crew there that will probably try their best to try and get a hive to you no matter where you are, but there are sometimes restrictions. So just contact customer support, those of you who are wondering how to get hold of them. Okie dokie. Are bees dangerous to keep around pets?
Dangerous around pets? Well, let's say if you've got a dog, they usually learn pretty quickly not to stick their nose in the entrance of the beehive. That's up to you whether you want to allow that to happen, and if you don't, then you could put a fence around your beehive to fence your pet away from it, which some people like to do. You see photographs online of people in their little nice white picket fence around their apiary, separating their pets from their hives. Equally, you'll see other people that just let their pets learn about what not to do with a beehive.
Nice. Now this is one I think people think, like when you're harvesting the honey cedar, how do you get the bees out of the way before getting the honey out? And I think some people also think maybe the brood is sometimes also in the flow frames.
Okay, so the way the hive is set up is with a queen excluder here, so the queen can only lay eggs down the bottom, so you've got your brood box down here with the queen laying eggs, raising her young, and the worker bees come up through the excluder, which the queen can't get through, so there's no larvae or baby bees in the flow frames. Now, as to whether there's bees down the cells, generally there's not, because you've waited till the cells are full of honey before harvesting. But sometimes you can get in a situation where there's an area the bees haven't filled, and there could be some bees down the cells when you're harvesting. Now, we put a lot of attention into that and a whole patent about it to make sure the bees had the minimum chance of getting harmed when they're down the cells. And the way we did that is we put gaps between the moving parts. So let's say the bees are building wax across between these parts here. They move like this to get the zigzagging column for the honey to flow down, and they move back, and then you've got a gap here. If we didn't have that, which some of our early prototypes had, then it could open, a bee could be in the cell and put a leg or a wing through this area, it could close and catch the bee. So that's why we made the design with a gap there, which if you look at the comb closely, you'll see those gaps we've left for the bee's knees. And I am very confident that this method of harvesting harms a lot less bees than conventional methods of extracting honey.
Can you get royal jelly from a flow hive?
Royal jelly is something secreted, it's a bit like mother's milk, secreted by the worker bees to feed young larvae in the first 3 days, or to feed a queen for her entire 11 days or so gestation as a larvae. Now, in terms of whether you can harvest it from any hive, but we haven't built in equipment for harvesting royal jelly, and I've never done it myself, so if you have some answers to how to go about that, then chime in and help answer in the comments.
Right, and does it matter which direction you face your flow hive?
It does not actually matter. For you as a home beekeeper, the primary thing you'll be wanting to do is point the entrance so the bees can set up a nice flight path up and away without getting into where humans might usually walk. So that'll be the first consideration. Now, there is a lot online saying which way you should point your hive, and that's come from commercial beekeeping, where it's said that if you point the hive entrance towards the morning sun, you'll get the bees up and working a bit quicker and you'll get more honey production. Now, for us as home beekeepers, that's probably further down the list of priorities than situating them where the flight path isn't going to be where people are walking.
Nice. JP's noticed that we have a lot of flowers around our hives and all planted around the apiary here. Are there any benefits or any drawbacks to having the plants so close to the hive?
Okay, the benefit is, aside from looking lovely, it attracts a lot of native bee species, and we're all about supporting the beekeepers, the European honeybees and the native bee species and the habitat to make them thrive. Now, native bees may only go, say, 200 metres in their foraging. So in urban areas, if you plant a garden like this, you'll be helping some of those species get from where they're going to the next area so they can keep multiplying, and perhaps you're creating an important stepping stone to create a corridor between our wild spaces, and you might just help save some of our key species from the brink of extinction. So planting beautiful gardens is actually for that reason. You don't need to plant a garden to get a honey crop. Your bees will be spreading out over a potentially 6-mile radius to bring that nectar back to your hive. So they'll be foraging far and wide, and you could just have them right on your lawn or on top of your rooftop with no garden at all.
Nice. Question from Shana, wondering, they've got a bit of a problem with some hive beetles. They have hive beetle traps, but there still seem to be a few around. Are there any other tips for getting rid of the little hive beetle?
So if you're in a steamy area like we are, the hive beetles do thrive in those humid locations, and you won't get rid of them altogether, I'm sorry to say, but what you'll do is manage them by trapping some of them and giving your colonies, especially when they're weak, a helping hand by putting some oil in your tray down here and letting the bees chase a bunch of them through that screen. And they'll drown in that oil because it'll block up the breathing of the hive beetles, and that'll just give your hive a help in hand. If you don't have our Flow Hive 2 with the screen bottom board and the pest management tray, then there's other traps you can make in your hive using the core flute slider. We'll post a link about that below. Basically, you can make what's called a fluff trap using the underside of the fabric commonly found in restaurants, where you got the vinyl on top, the fluffy side underneath, and you can stick that to your slider, and a bunch of beetles will get their legs tangled in that fluff, and you'll be able to catch beetles that way.
Great. And how do you know when the honey's ready to harvest?
So if you dial back to the start of this video, you'll see that these cells were capped and ready. They were full of honey, and you could even see the capping down the edge. Now, when you see that, as soon as you see that in the end frame, you can be reasonably sure that the rest of the frame is mostly capped, and you can go ahead and harvest. Some bees will be problematic and they won't ever fill the end frame. That'll make it a bit harder to tell, and you'll be using your observations of looking down in between the frames here to see whether they're capping, looking in the side windows to see whether they're capped, and potentially pulling frames out to match up what's going on the outside of the hive with what's going on in the middle. And even if you've got bees that don't fill the end frames, you can learn by observation when it's time to harvest, even without pulling the frames out of the hive.
Great. So can you just mention again what type of bees we have in the Flow Hive?
So these are Apis mellifera, the European honeybee that humans have taken all around the world wherever they go. There's different breeds of them. Here they're a bit of a mongrel breed. We've just got bees that have mated with a number of different drones in the area. They could be Italians, could be Caucasian, could be Carnolian. It doesn't really matter. What you're looking for is a flourishing hive with a nice gentle temperament. And if you go to a bee breeder, they'll be breeding for those qualities, and away you go.
Nice. Does it hurt the bee to clip the queen's wings?
It's not something I've done, and if you've got information on clipping queen's wings, chime in. The idea by doing that is the hive is less likely to swarm if the queen can't fly. In fact, it can't swarm, so that would be a swarm preventative measure that some beekeepers might experiment with. Now, you do risk that she still gets pushed out of the hive by half the bees and she can't fly but doesn't make it back into the hive, so that technique might turn around and bite you as well.
And so why do the bees start filling from the middle of the Flow Hive?
That's a good question. I'm not sure why, but they tend to sort of move outwards from the centre of a hive. Not always. They generally will start their brood right in the middle of a cavity. In this case it's a bee box, and they will then have a configuration where you've got brood in the centre, pollen and honey stores out towards the edges. And the reason why they do that is honey becomes a thermal mass and helps regulate the warmth of the brood nest inside. So if you think about it as a whole colony, you've got brood here in the center box, honey around the edges, including above. So they'll start right above here and then fill to create that circular pattern above the brood nest, and then work their way out towards the extremities, being the ends and the sides of the frames. You'll see that happening when the bees are hungry. They'll actually eat in that same order, so they will start consuming honey directly above the brood nest. So when you start seeing signs that the bees are hungry, you can leave those center frames because they're likely to have eaten out some of the frames in kind of a moon shape above the brood nest. If you still need some honey, you might just harvest some of the edge ones. And when you see the bees are bringing in nectar again, they would have filled in that center above the brood nest. Go ahead and harvest the center ones. So a little tip there, don't worry too much. If you see honey at the end, go ahead and harvest. Every once in a blue moon you might accidentally harvest honey that's a little runny. Not the end of the world, it'll still be super yummy, it just won't keep on the shelf forever, which it doesn't in my house anyway, because my family gets into it.
Well, Seeds, and as our jar's about to be full, and we've got a great question I think to finish up on here, and it's basically, and it's a question that a lot of people call in to ask, is how do you decide whether you should have a 6 frame or a 7 flow hive?
Okay, so I prefer the 6, which is this one here, and this is the 7. So you've got 2 different sizes to choose from, and they correspond with the 2 different sizes of Langstroth brood boxes in the world. So the reason why we went for those 2 sizes is so that people could match the supers to their existing equipment if they didn't want the whole kit and caboodle, and they just wanted to put one of these honey supers atop a normal Langstroth hive. So we've gone ahead and followed suit. So one of the primary reasons is to match existing equipment. The second one is, in colder climates, people tend to choose larger colonies, or larger size boxes, so they get larger colonies, so they've got more honey stores to survive a long winter ahead. So for that reason, the Flow 7 with 1 extra flow frame and 2 extra brood frames in it becomes the popular choice in those colder regions. Having said that, I've been to our coldest area of Australia, Tasmania. One commercial beekeeper will swear that you need 10 frame boxes, 3 stacked high, or your bees will not survive the winter. And around the corner, you've got someone keeping bees in this configuration commercially, and they're surviving perfectly through the winter. So it does a little bit depend on the experience and how you manage your bees. You probably find you can have either size. One advantage of the smaller size is it's a bit lighter to lift that top box off when it comes time for your brood inspections. So many great questions here. We're going to show you how to finish up the honey harvest. It's quite easy. All you do is turn this key back to a 90. You're going in the very top slot now, pushing it all the way to the back and putting that to a 90 again, and that pushes all the flow frame parts back into the cell formed position. If you can, leave the key in that position for a minute or 2 just to make sure all of the parts move down into the correct hexagon shape. If you do a quick close, you might find they bounce back up when they hit sticky wax and propolis, and that might form issues like spilling later on down the track when you've got big blobs of wax trying to make a wobbly shaped cell perform like a honey cell, and then this big blob of wax might limit the honey flow next time you go to harvest. For that reason, leave your key like that for a minute or 2 as you finish up that harvesting process. So all I need to do now is take this tube out and put in this cap. Now this is a beautifully full 3 kilograms of honey, and I'm just going to do the hot swap there and put the cap in. Managed to not spill even a drop of honey, which is nice. And this is really the only messy bit to clean up. which is very, very different to conventional harvesting, where you've got a whole workshop or laundry or shed that you've made into a honey extracting room to clean up after harvesting. So you can enjoy tasting those spoils and simply put that in the dishwasher or just give it a little rinse and it's ready to go for next time. Don't leave it out for the bees. You do not want to leave honey exposed for the bees. Like you see here, the bees aren't in a hungry time. They haven't come for the honey, but if they do, I will encourage you just to cover up your jar as you're harvesting with a wax wrap or some kitchen wrap. Wrap it around the tube. Make sure bees aren't going for the honey. You don't want them to get into a robbing mood, or they might just start stealing honey from other hives, spreading pathogens around and potentially weakening those colonies they're stealing from. So that'll go back to the kitchen. Next, we can take that out now because it's been a minute, and we're just back to a 90, out again. A little cap goes in the top. So it really is an extremely easy and gentle way to harvest honey. The bees have hardly noticed. We've got a beautiful big jar of honey here, and we can just pack up, and it's just enough room for me to put the lid on. A couple of weeks back I was overflowing these jars because sometimes the bees make so much honey that it just overflows. But look at that. And one thing that's amazing is it's perfectly ready for the table. You don't have to go through that once process that I used to do in conventional honey harvesting, where you had to go through now a sieving and settling phase in order to get honey that's ready to go. You can literally sell jars of honey without having to filter at all. At worst, you might scoop an ant or two that's jumped in the jar as you've been harvesting, and they'll float to the top. But look at that, gorgeous. Another flute of honey for the kitchen. Thanks a lot for tuning in this week for our beginner beekeeping Q&A. If you've got answers to people's questions, keep chiming in. That's what it's all about, is helping people get started in the fascinating world of beekeeping. Also let us know what you'd like us to cover next week, and we'll be back with a show and tell, and we'll be getting into the brood box next week to show you what's happening down below here, where the queen's laying her eggs and the whole hive is doing their thing, creating their young, looking after them, doing their pollen and bee bread stores, and